Don't open the champagne, Ava Monroe said, her voice calm enough to make the room go even quieter. A row of crystal flutes caught the chandelier light at the far end of the dining room. Already poured, already waiting, already certain of a celebration that had not happened yet. Every head turned toward her. The string quartet near the terrace doors faltered for half a beat before finding the melody again. Softer now, cautious, as if even the music understood something had just shifted. Edward Holloway slowly lowered his glass. His wife, Margaret, held her smile a second too long. The kind of smile people wear when they are used to controlling a room and suddenly can't feel the floor beneath them. Blake Holloway stopped tapping his gold fountain pen against the leather folder in front of him. Lillian, draped in white silk and old-money confidence, stared at Ava as though she were still trying to fit the woman standing at the head of the table with the one she had dismissed less than an hour earlier. Ava did not move right away. She stood beneath a spill of warm light in a black tailored suit that looked sharp without trying too hard, one hand resting lightly on the back of an empty chair, the other holding a slim folder against her side. She was not smiling. She was not angry. That was what unsettled them most. Anger, they knew how to answer. Hurt, they could ignore. But composure like hers had a way of making other people hear themselves. Outside the glass walls, the Connecticut night stretched over the lawn in dark velvet, the hedge lights glowing low and expensive, the fountain beyond the terrace sending up a soft silver mist. Inside, the Holloway estate looked exactly like what it had always been designed to look like. Inherited power polish to a shine. Oil portraits in gilt frames. White orchids in stone bowls. A dining table long enough to make conversation feel like strategy. 40 minutes earlier, Ava had walked into this house through the side entrance reserved for private guests and senior business partners, and even then, the air had told her what kind of evening it intended to be. A valet had hesitated before offering to take her car key, his eyes flicking once from her face to the understated badge on her key ring and back. Again, a woman near the coat check had handed Ava a program and asked if she was with the event staff. Not rudely, almost sweetly. The kind of sweet that leaves a mark because it expects you to swallow it. Then came Lillian, all diamonds and polished indifference, glancing at Ava's suit and saying, "We're keeping service traffic through the back hall tonight." Just one sentence. Light as air, sharp as glass. Ava had looked at her for a moment, then handed her business card to the woman beside her instead. The assistant's face changed first. Then the silence spread. Chief Executive Officer. Monroe Atlantic Partners. Lillian's fingers had stiffened around her phone, but no apology came. Only a thinner smile, colder now, and a casual, "Well, this should be interesting." Ava remembered that line as she looked around the table in the present, at the untouched champagne, the silver serving dome still closed over the sea base, the billion-dollar family waiting for her to act grateful for a seat she had been invited to fill. She let the quiet breathe 1 second longer, then lifted her chin just slightly. "Because after tonight," she said, and even the ice in the water glasses seemed to stop moving, "there is no deal." For a moment, no one spoke. The chandeliers hummed softly above them, and somewhere beyond the terrace, a fountain kept spilling water into stone as if nothing inside the house had changed. Edward Holloway was the first to move. He set his glass down with deliberate care, the crystal making a small, precise sound against the linen-covered table. "I am sorry," he said, in the tone of a man who had spent his life confusing control with grace. "I must have misheard you." Ava Monroe did not sit. She slid the slim folder from under her arm and placed it on the polished walnut table without opening it. "You heard me correctly." Margaret's smile returned, but only at the corners, brittle and strained. "Let us not turn one tense moment into theater," she said. "We invited you here in good faith." Ava looked at her then, fully, and Margaret's hand tightened around the stem of her glass. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but Ava had built an empire learning to read almost nothing. Blake leaned back in his chair and gave a short laugh that landed flat. In the room. "Come on," he said. "This is a $900 million transaction, not a college debate. If there is a concern, our legal teams can clean it up tonight." Ava shifted her gaze to him, calm and exact. "Clean it up," she repeated, as though testing the weight of the phrase. "That would be easier if your team had not spent the last 2 weeks trying to bury it." Lillian inhaled sharply. Edward's face did not change much, but the skin along his jaw pulled tighter. At the far end of the table, two outside counsel from Holloway Strategic Exchange began flipping through their binders, the pages whispering fast under nervous fingers. The string quartet had stopped completely now. No one had told them to stop. They had simply sensed that music no longer belonged in the room. Ava noticed the young server near the sideboard, the same one Blake had snapped at earlier after a champagne flute slipped and shattered near the kitchen doors. The boy could not have been more than 19. He was standing very still now, hands clasped behind his back, eyes lowered, trying to become invisible in a room built by people who had never needed to disappear. Ava remembered kneeling beside him on the marble floor, helping gather glittering pieces of glass into a linen napkin while Blake muttered about standards and embarrassment. She had looked up then and found Edward watching from across the hall, measuring her, not with respect but curiosity, like he was trying to decide whether kindness in someone powerful was real or just strategy. Now that same curiosity was turning into something less comfortable. "You are making a mistake," Edward said at last. His voice had dropped lower, the polished warmth gone from it. "Deals of this size survive friction. Strong people do not walk away because of one unpleasant evening." Ava tilted her head just slightly. "This is not about an unpleasant evening." She tapped the folder once with her fingertips. "This is about a concealed environmental exposure tied to Holloway Biothermal's Texas assets. It is about side letters your office failed to disclose. It is about liabilities parked just far enough from the main structure that you hoped no one would see them before signature." Blake straightened so quickly his chair legs scraped the floor. Margaret turned to him. Just once, too quickly for anyone but Ava to miss. And there it was. Not surprise. Recognition. Ava felt the room narrow. The candles in their glass cylinders flickered against mirrored walls, throwing soft gold over old money and careful faces. "That is not true," Margaret said, but the sentence arrived a beat too late. Ava opened the folder. The first page made a clean sound as she laid it flat on the table between the untouched champagne and the silver serving fork. "Then you should have no trouble explaining why your private compliance memo was revised at 4:14 this afternoon," she said. "Or why my analysts received the original version anyway." Blake did not touch the page at first. He stared at it the way men stare at a problem they think can still be bullied into becoming smaller. The candlelight trembled against the rim of his water glass, and for one strange second the whole table looked less like a victory dinner and more like a courtroom with expensive flowers. Edward reached for the document instead. His fingers were steady, but Ava noticed the slight pause before he turned the first sheet, the faint hesitation of a man who already knew too much. His eyes scanned the memo in silence. Then he turned the page. Then another. Margaret sat perfectly still beside him, spine straight, pearls resting against her collarbone like they had been placed there with measuring tools. Only the pulse at the base of her throat betrayed her. "This was an internal draft," she said finally. "Too quick, too polished. Preliminary language. Nothing more." Ava rested her hand lightly on the back of the chair in front of her. "Then why was the original marked final for executive circulation?" she asked. No one answered. At the far end of the table, one of the outside attorneys adjusted his glasses and leaned closer, his face losing color line by line. The older one beside him quietly closed his binder, as if some part of him had already decided he did not want his fingerprints on the rest of the evening. Blake pushed back from the table and stood. "This is absurd," he said. "You are taking ordinary diligence and spinning it into a scandal because you want leverage." Ava looked at him without blinking. "If I wanted leverage, I would have called the press before dessert." That landed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It simply settled into the middle of the room and stayed there. Lillian turned toward her brother, then toward her father, and for the first time all night her confidence seemed to thin around the edges. She had spent the evening dressed in effortless whiteness, in the old certainty that rooms like this were built to forgive people like her for anything. Now she looked younger than she had an hour ago, less composed, more ordinary. Ava did not enjoy that. She was too tired for triumph to feel glamorous. What she felt instead was a colder thing, a quiet disappointment with sharp corners. She had known families like this all her life. They smiled with their mouths and sorted with their eyes. They asked where you were from when what they meant was how did you get in here. Earlier that evening, Margaret had complimented Ava on being surprisingly grounded. then asked whether Monroe Atlantic had received any diversity-based tax incentives in its early years. The words had been wrapped in a laugh so soft it almost sounded elegant. Ava had smiled back and said no, just profits. She remembered the silence that followed. She remembered Blake looking down at his plate as if her answer had inconvenienced him. She remembered Edward changing the subject to legacy admissions at Yale. Now, in the present, legacy was sitting right in front of him in black ink and revised timestamps. Edward placed the pages back on the table with more care than before. Who else has seen this? He asked. There it was. Not denial. Not outrage. Calculation. Ava heard the fountain outside, the low hush of water over stone, and somewhere in the kitchen a tray being moved too quickly, silver tapping porcelain. My full transaction team, she said. My board. 2 independent compliance advisors. And by midnight, if I choose, federal counsel. Margaret's breath caught so softly it might have been mistaken for the air conditioning. Blake laughed again, but there was nothing easy in it now. You would destroy a deal of this size over a disclosure fight? Ava turned toward him fully. No, she said. I would walk away from a deal of this size because your family mistook my professionalism for tolerance. The room went still all over again. Even the young server near the wall lifted his eyes for half a second before lowering them. Edward studied her face then, really studied it, and something in his expression shifted. Not kindness. Not yet. Just recognition. The kind that comes too late to save anything. Ava, he said, using her first name for the first time that night, as if intimacy might soften consequence. Let us be reasonable. Ava's gaze did not move. I have been reasonable since the moment I walked through your door, she said. That is why this conversation is still happening in private. Edward Holloway had spent a lifetime in rooms where one lowered voice from him could reset the balance of power. Ava could see him reaching for that instinct now, trying to gather the evening back into his hands one careful sentence at a time. He folded his hands on the table, thumbs touching, posture composed. The portrait of a man who had once charmed regulators, rivals, and reporters into believing that calm was the same thing as honesty. Then let us keep it private, he said. Name the adjustment you want. Revised indemnity language. Expanded escrow. Additional oversight. We can solve this tonight. Ava looked at him for a long second. The white orchids in the center of the table gave off almost no scent, but the candles around them carried a faint trace of warm wax into the air, mixing with sea base, lemon, and the expensive chill of central air that kept old houses feeling untouched by weather. You still think this is about structure, she said. It is about judgment. Blake let out a breath through his nose and reached for his glass, but when he lifted it, Ava noticed the water trembling faintly against the crystal. You are making this personal because you can, he said. That is not leadership. That is ego. Ava almost smiled, but it never fully arrived. Interesting, she said softly. Coming from the man who asked my assistant whether I had built my firm or inherited good timing. Blake's face hardened. Margaret turned to him with a quick, warning glance, but the damage was already in the room, floating above the silver flatware and folded linen like smoke no one could wave away. Edward shifted his attention to his son. Blake. It was only a name, but it carried enough cold command to make the younger man go quiet. Ava noticed the outside attorneys exchange a look. They were no longer participating. They were observing, the way people do when a family starts revealing itself in front of witnesses. Lillian stared down at the reflection of the candles in her spoon. Earlier, she had laughed when Margaret asked Ava whether her firm's style of leadership leaned more community-minded than institutional. It had been one of those polished questions meant to sound academic while quietly pushing someone back toward a stereotype. Ava had answered by listing Monroe Atlantic's 12-year performance against the S&P and the firm's 3 largest exits by dollar value. No one at the table had asked that question again. Now she let the memory sit there between them. You all showed me exactly who you thought I was before the numbers made you nervous, Ava said. That matters. In my line of work, it matters more than the spreadsheets. Edward leaned back a fraction, and the leather of his chair gave a soft sigh. The fountain outside kept pouring silver into stone. Somewhere in the hall, a grandfather clock marked the quarter hour with a muted chime. Time was moving. Ava could feel it in her wrist, in the steady weight of her watch, in the near-silent vibration of her phone against the inside pocket of her blazer. Her team was waiting. She had told them to hold until she gave the word. Margaret placed her napkin beside her plate with such precision it almost looked rehearsed. If there were comments tonight that struck the wrong tone, she said, then I regret that. But surely you understand that families like ours are under constant pressure. We evaluate everyone carefully. Ava turned to her slowly. Families like yours, she repeated. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. The sentence had turned on her before she could fix it. Ava did not rescue her. She had rescued enough people in rooms like this, smoothing over insult to keep business alive, teaching herself to swallow what others called misunderstandings because the numbers were large and the stakes were larger. But there was always a cost to that kind of swallowing. It lived in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the quiet drive back to the hotel when the city lights looked cold and far away. Not tonight. Tonight the cost would not be hers. Her phone vibrated again. Once. Precise. The final confirmation. She slipped it from her pocket, glanced at the screen, and set it face down beside the folder. Blake watched the motion too quickly. Edward noticed him noticing. The room narrowed even further. What is it? Edward asked. Ava lifted her eyes to his. Her voice, when it came, was almost gentle. My analysts just confirmed the hidden exposure is worse than we thought, she said. And they also confirmed something else. No one moved. The candles flickered in the mirrored wall behind them, multiplying the room into gold and glass and anxious faces. Ava placed 2 fingers on the closed folder, then looked straight at Edward Holloway. Your lenders know you need this deal by Friday. The sentence did not explode. It settled. That was worse. Ava watched it move across the table in silence, watched each face receive it in a different way. Edward did not flinch, but the stillness in him changed shape. It was no longer the stillness of authority. It was calculation under pressure, the kind that comes when a man realizes the timeline in his head belongs to someone else now. Blake looked at his father first, not Ava, and that told her everything. Margaret's fingers drifted toward the stem of her glass, then stopped halfway, as if even that small motion might reveal too much. Lillian stared at Ava with the stunned brightness of someone who had spent her whole life inside velvet certainty and had never imagined that certainty could develop cracks in public. You have been digging, Edward said at last. His tone was level, but some of the old warmth had gone missing, leaving behind polished steel. Ava did not sit. She had no intention of making herself comfortable in a room that had tried, from the first moment, to make her smaller. That is what due diligence is for, she said. You should be grateful my firm still believes in doing it. One of the outside attorneys cleared his throat, then seemed to think better of speaking. The older one reached for the memo again, scanning the revised time stamp with the tired expression of a man already rewriting his own recollection of the evening. The candles burned lower in their glass cylinders, and the mirrored wall behind the dining table reflected the scene back in fragments. White orchids, folded linen, hollow confidence, and Ava's black suit cutting through the gold light like a line no one in the room had seen until it was too late. Edward drew a slow breath. What exactly do you think you know about our lenders? He asked. Ava slid her phone across the table, not all the way to him, just enough for the screen to glow between the silverware and the untouched champagne. A brief email chain. A subject line marked urgent. 2 names from a private credit desk in Manhattan. A phrase highlighted by her team less than 3 minutes earlier. Conditional extension contingent upon Monroe Atlantic transaction closing before market open Friday. Blake leaned forward so fast his chair legs grated against the hardwood. Margaret turned pale in a way makeup could not hide. Edward read the message once, then again, and set the phone down with care. This is confidential, he said quietly. It was, Ava replied. Right up until your people started moving liabilities around like they were decorative furniture. The young server by the wall shifted his weight almost soundlessly. Ava noticed because she noticed everything tonight, the way she always did when a room had decided to test whether she belonged in it. She remembered another boardroom years ago in Atlanta, before Monroe Atlantic had its own floor, when a banker twice her age had smiled and asked whether she was there to present or to take notes. She had smiled back then too. She had learned early that some people only recognized power after it cost them money. Edward folded his hands again, but this time the gesture looked less like command and more like containment. If this financing window is tight, he said, that only proves our mutual interest in finding a path forward. Ava almost admired the discipline of the line. Almost. No, she said. It proves your family needed this deal more than mine, and still chose arrogance over honesty. Blake stood again. You are enjoying this. His voice was sharper now, stripped of polish. Ava turned to him, and for the first time all evening there was a trace of real cold in her face. No, she said. I am documenting it. That silenced him more effectively than any raised voice could have. Margaret looked down at her plate, at the fish that had gone untouched long enough to lose its sheen. Lillian reached for her water glass and missed the stem on the first try. Edward saw it all and said nothing. He had finally begun to understand what the room looked like from Ava's side. Not elegant, not impressive, just expensive and careless. Ava picked up her folder, aligned its edges with one precise motion, and rested it against her palm. Here is what happens next, she said. You stop pretending this is a misunderstanding. You stop treating my discretion like a weakness. And you listen very carefully, because the next decision I make will determine whether this stays inside these walls for another 10 minutes. Edward Holloway did not answer right away. He sat in the gold wash of candlelight with his hands folded so neatly in front of him that, from a distance, he might have looked untouched. But Ava had spent too many years around men like him not to see the fracture lines when they formed. The fracture was in the pause, in the way his eyes remained on the folder instead of her face, in the quiet shift of his shoulders, as if the room itself had become heavier by a few pounds all at once. You are threatening us in our own home, Margaret said. Her voice was low and controlled, but it carried that familiar note Ava had heard since she was 26, in closing rooms twice as old as she was, the note that always appeared when certain people realized courtesy would not rescue them. Ava turned to her. No, she said. I am being clear in a house that has confused politeness with permission all night. That landed harder than the documents had. Margaret looked away first. Blake took 2 steps toward the end of the table, then stopped when Edward lifted one finger without even looking at him. The gesture was slight, practiced, final. Sit down. Blake obeyed. The older attorneys watched it happen in silence, their legal pads untouched now, their role in the evening shrinking by the second. Lillian reached for the champagne flute nearest her, and then seemed to remember Ava's first sentence of the night. She let her hand fall back into her lap. The glass remained untouched, catching chandelier light like a promise no one trusted anymore. Ava let the stillness stretch. Outside, the terrace lights glowed over the trimmed lawn, and a thin breeze moved through the hedges just enough to stir their shadows against the window. It was the kind of estate people photographed from magazines and charity brochures, the kind of place built to reassure the world that wealth could look tasteful if it stayed quiet enough. Tonight it looked like a stage after the music had stopped. Edward finally spoke. What do you want? The question was direct, stripped of charm now. No more legacy language. No more gracious host. Just the true center of men like him. Name the price. Ava almost pitied how predictable that was. That question, she said softly, is the reason we are here. Edward frowned. Do not play with words. I am not. Ava rested the folder on the table and slid out one single page from the back, not a legal memo this time, not lender correspondence, but a short profile summary from her own team. Holloway strategic exchange. Debt pressure increasing. Internal confidence unstable. Market sensitivity elevated. Beneath that, one line highlighted in pale yellow. Reputation risk accelerated by failed flagship merger. She placed the page down where all of them could see it. You believed I would stay because the money was large, she said. You believed I would overlook the hidden exposure because this room was impressive. And before you knew who I was, you believed I could be mistaken for staff, redirected to the back hall, and spoken to like I should feel lucky to be present. That is not a deal problem. That is a judgment problem. No one interrupted. Even Blake did not try. Earlier that evening, before the first document came out, Ava had stood alone for a moment near the long gallery by the dining room entrance, studying a row of black and white family photographs in silver frames. Yale, boats, ski slopes, campaign dinners, summer homes, generations of being expected. She had heard Lillian behind her, whispering to a guest in a pale blue gown. Father says she is brilliant, but these self-made types always need to prove something. Ava had not turned around then. She had only let the sentence settle where it belonged, beside every other polished insult dressed up as observation. Now she looked at Lillian across the table, and Lillian could not hold her gaze for more than a second. Edward exhaled slowly. "If apologies are due," he said, "then make no mistake, we can address that." Ava's expression did not change. "Apologies offered after leverage. Appears are not apologies," she said. "They are weather reports." One of the attorneys lowered his eyes, almost hiding a reaction. Blake stared at the tablecloth. Margaret pressed her lips together so tightly the color drained from them. Ava picked up her phone and unlocked it with one smooth motion. Her thumb hovered once above the screen. Edward saw it and leaned forward for the first time all evening. Not much. Just enough. The room caught the movement. So did Ava. "My board has already drafted the withdrawal notice," she said. "The only thing missing is whether I release it now, or whether I give your family the chance to hear the full reason from me before the market hears it from everyone else." No one in the room seemed to breathe after that. Ava stood with her phone in one hand and the reflection of the chandeliers burning in the dark glass behind her, while the Holloway family sat arranged around the table like a portrait beginning to crack under its own varnish. Edward looked older now, not in years, but in weight, as if the polished architecture of the evening had finally collapsed onto his shoulders. Blake's jaw tightened and released, tightened and released. A man trying to look unaffected while his pulse betrayed him from the side of his neck. Margaret's eyes moved from Ava's phone to the highlighted memo, then to Edward, calculating outcomes the way some people count rosary beads. Lillian had gone still in the fragile, bewildered way of someone who had always assumed that humiliation belonged to other people. Ava noticed everything. The cold gleam of the serving fork near Edward's hand. The tiny crescent of water beneath Blake's glass. The faint scent of lemon butter cooling on plates no one had touched. The silence itself had texture now. It felt like polished stone. Edward was the one who broke it. "You said you would give us the chance to hear the full reason," he said. His voice was measured again, but there was strain beneath the polish now, a note of urgency wrapped in discipline. "Then say it." Ava lowered her phone, though she did not put it away. "You want the business reason or the honest one?" Edward held her gaze. They had better be the same. Ava looked at him for a beat, then slowly set the phone face down. Beside the folder. "They are not the same," she said. "That is your first problem." The words moved across the table like cold air. One of the outside attorneys shifted in his chair, then straightened his pen beside his notepad, as if order on paper could somehow compensate for the disorder in the room. Ava stepped away from the chair she had been holding and took one slow pace toward the center of the table. The heels of her shoes made a clean sound on the hardwood floor. Not loud. Precise. "The business reason," she said, "is that your family attempted to close a flagship transaction while concealing material exposure and relying on timing pressure from your lenders. That alone is enough for Monroe Atlantic to walk away." She let that sit for a moment. Edward did not interrupt. Blake looked like he wanted to. Margaret knew better than to let him. Ava's voice stayed even. "The honest reason is that I watched all of you reveal your judgment before you thought I had any power worth respecting." Margaret drew a careful breath. "That is unfair." Ava turned to her. "Is it?" she asked, almost gently. "You asked whether my firm was built on incentives instead of performance. Your daughter redirected me toward the service corridor. Your son suggested I was lucky to be in this room at all. And you all did it before you knew whether I could help you." Lillian's face changed first, color draining so gradually it was almost elegant. Blake leaned forward, defensive by reflex. "You are twisting casual remarks into some grand moral indictment." Ava did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "No," she said. "I am describing a pattern rich people often call casual because it has never cost them anything." The young server by the wall looked down fast, but not before Ava caught the flicker in his expression, that quick, private recognition people share when they have spent too much of life being underestimated in nice rooms. Edward followed Ava's glance without turning his head. For a moment something unreadable crossed his face. Shame, perhaps, though it was too late and too disciplined to soften anything. Ava remembered being 29 in Chicago, walking into a private equity breakfast where an older man had smiled and asked whether she was speaking on the panel or handling logistics. She remembered, smiling back and saying, "Both, if your panel falls apart." They had laughed then. The kind of laugh that pretends everything is fine because truth sounds dangerous when spoken too cleanly. Tonight there was no laughter. Edward rested his forearms on the table. "If we have wronged you," he said, "then I am prepared to say so plainly." Ava looked at him for a long second, and in that second the whole room seemed to wait on whether dignity might still be rescued from the evening like silver from a fireproof box. "That would matter more," she said, "if you had found your plainness before the leverage." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed once, muted and exact. Ava picked up her phone again, her thumb hovering just above the draft email her board had prepared. Withdrawal notice. Scheduled release. Counsel copied. Edward saw the screen light up. So did Blake. So did Margaret. Lillian closed her eyes for half a second, as if the room had become too bright. Ava inhaled slowly, then looked at each of them in turn. "I am going to ask one question," she said. "And whatever happens in the next 60 seconds will depend on whether anyone at this table is finally willing to answer it honestly." The room held still around Ava's words, but it was no longer the stillness of wealth or confidence. It was the stillness of people realizing that truth had entered the room and sat down before any of them had noticed. Ava let her gaze move from Edward to Margaret, from Margaret to Blake, then finally to Lillian. The candles had burned low enough now that their flames looked thinner, sharper, each one reflected twice in the mirrored wall behind the sideboard. The untouched champagne had gone flat in its flutes. Even celebration, it seemed, had lost patience. Ava kept her phone in her hand, screen dark for the moment, warm from her palm. "My question is simple," she said. "If I had walked into this house tonight as a white man in the same suit, with the same numbers, and the same authority, would any of you have spoken to me the way you did?" No one answered. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with every glance, every redirect, every polished insult that had floated through the evening pretending to be manners. Blake looked away first, his eyes dropping to the silver knife beside his plate. Margaret shifted in her chair and reached for language the way some people reach for jewelry, hoping the right piece might still save the outfit. "That is not a fair question," she said at last. Ava's expression did not change. "It is the only fair question that has been asked in this room tonight." Edward leaned back slowly, and the leather chair gave another quiet sigh beneath him. He looked toward the windows instead of at her, toward the darkness over the lawn, the clipped hedges silvered by landscape lights, the fountain still turning water into something elegant, because that was what money taught things to do. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. It had lost some of its polish. "No," he said. One word. Quiet. Heavy. Blake looked up sharply. Lillian's mouth parted. Margaret turned to her husband, as if she had not expected honesty to arrive from him at all. Ava did not move. She had heard too many almost truths in rooms like this to mistake one correct syllable for transformation. Edward folded his hands again, but there was no performance in it now. "No," he repeated, eyes still on the window for 1 second longer before returning to her. "If you had been a white man with the same credentials, this evening would have begun differently." The words settled over the table like ash after a fire no one had admitted was burning. Margaret drew in a breath, offended less by the truth than by the fact that it had been spoken aloud. "Edward." It was not quite a warning, not quite a plea, more like disbelief dressed in silk. He did not look at her. Blake gave a short, disbelieving laugh, but there was no force behind it. "So that is what this is now?" he asked. "A morality play?" Ava turned to him. "No," she said. "This is accountability catching up to a room that thought it was too expensive to be honest." The younger attorney at the far end lowered his eyes so quickly it almost looked like shame by proxy. Lillian sat very still, the old confidence gone from her posture now. Ava remembered the first thing Lillian had said near the coat check, that soft redirection toward the back hall, said with a smile made of inheritance and habit. It had not sounded cruel then. That was always the trick. The worst judgments rarely announced themselves with raised voices. They arrived with smooth tone, clean fabric, and the assumption that the person receiving them would absorb the sting quietly and keep the evening moving. Ava had done that before. In conference hotels, in boardrooms, on private tarmacs, and in gallery fundraisers where people asked her which athlete or entertainer she was there with before learning she was the one financing the acquisition. She had absorbed it because numbers had been waiting on the other side. Growth had been waiting. Opportunity had been waiting. But there came a point, always, when swallowing one more insult started to taste like agreement. Edward looked at her with something close to weariness now. You have your answer, he said. What happens next? Ava glanced down at her phone, then at the highlighted memo, then at the line from the lenders that had stripped the room of its illusion. She could feel the eyes on her. Not because they respected her. Not fully. Not yet. Because they finally understood she could leave. That was the language they had always been fluent in. She set the phone on the table, screen facing up this time, the draft withdrawal notice glowing softly beneath the candlelight. What happens next, she said, her voice steady as glass, depends on whether your family understands that admitting the truth is not the same thing as being changed by it. Edward did not answer her right away. He looked at the glowing withdrawal notice on Ava's phone the way a man looks at a door that has already begun to close, knowing the handle is still there, but no longer certain it belongs to him. The candles along the center of the table had burned low enough to leave soft amber pools on the linen, and the mirrored wall behind them reflected every face twice, making the room feel crowded with versions of the same mistake. Margaret sat with her shoulders drawn tight, elegant even in discomfort, but the elegance had turned brittle. Blake looked from the phone to his father and back again, waiting for someone older, richer, or whiter to restore the order he had always mistaken for permanence. Lillian kept her hands folded in her lap, so carefully that Ava could see the tension in her wrists. It struck Ava then that none of them looked powerful anymore. They only looked expensive, changed by it. Edward repeated quietly, as if testing whether the phrase belonged in his mouth. He glanced toward the tall windows again, toward the dark lawn and the fountain throwing silver upward in the distance, then back to Ava. Tell me what that would look like to you. Ava did not answer immediately. She let the question sit in the center of the room, because some questions deserve to feel their own weight before anyone rushed to make them comfortable. Somewhere in the kitchen, a service door opened and closed. The faint smell of coffee drifted in, dark and warm, as if the house itself had already given up on dinner and moved on to aftermath. It would look like this not becoming a negotiation, Ava said at last. It would look like no one here trying to convert honesty into a discount. Blake gave a small, humorless laugh. Everything is a negotiation. Ava turned to him. That belief is exactly why your family cannot tell the difference between consequence and inconvenience. The words landed cleanly. Blake opened his mouth, then stopped when Edward lifted his hand again, not sharply, just enough to make the point. Margaret stared at the tablecloth, at the tiny gold shadows cast by the candlelight, and for a moment Ava wondered whether she was replaying the evening in her head now, hearing herself the way other people had heard her all along. The questions wrapped in compliments. The assumptions dressed as standards. The way she had spoken about families like ours, as though the phrase were neutral, as though everyone in the room would quietly accept who it was built to include and who it was not. Ava knew that pattern too well. She had heard it at charity galas where people praised her confidence, with the faint surprise of people complimenting a dog for learning to open a gate. She had heard it in corporate retreats where men with inherited last names asked whether she found high finance emotionally exhausting, as if competence changed color when it came through her. Tonight had not invented anything new. It had simply removed the velvet from an old blade. Edward exhaled slowly and rested his forearms on the table. Then no, he said. I will not negotiate what happened here. Margaret looked at him, startled again. Lillian blinked hard and lowered her eyes. Blake leaned back in his chair, frustration moving through him like static, but even he stayed quiet. Ava watched Edward carefully. Men like him were trained from childhood to survive by tone. A perfect apology, a measured pause, the right admission at the right time. She had seen many of them mistake performance for repair. You are right, Edward said. We saw what we wanted to see when you walked in. We judged before we knew. And even after we knew, some of us kept speaking from that same place because we assumed the room would protect us from the cost. The silence that followed felt different. Not softer, just more honest. Ava looked at him for a long second, searching for the seam where strategy ended and self-knowledge began. It was hard to tell. It was always hard to tell. Her phone screen dimmed slightly, the draft email still open, counsel copied, release ready. She placed one fingertip on the glass and felt its faint warmth. That is the first true thing your family has said tonight, she said. Now comes the part you are really afraid of. Edward's gaze held steady on hers. Which is? Ava lifted the phone, turned the screen toward herself, and read the subject line once more before looking up. Whether truth came early enough to matter. Edward's eyes stayed on Ava's face, but the room around them had already started to give itself away in smaller ways. One of the candles near the orchids sputtered and leaned, leaving a thin ribbon of wax down the glass. A fork lay untouched beside Margaret's plate, angled just slightly wrong. The kind of tiny disorder that never survived long in houses like this unless something larger had gone wrong first. The young server near the wall shifted his weight again, still trying to disappear without moving. Even the air felt different now, less curated, more human. Ava knew that feeling. It was what happened when power stopped performing and started sweating. She held the phone in one hand and looked at Edward Holloway the way she looked at market conditions, with precision and no appetite for fantasy. "The part you are afraid of," she said, "is whether I still believe your family deserves access to mine." Edward frowned faintly. "Your family?" Ava did not answer in a hurry. She set the phone down beside the folder and let her fingertips rest on the tablecloth, smooth Irish linen, probably hand-pressed that afternoon by staff members whose names no one at the table knew. "Monroe Atlantic is not just my firm," she said. "It is every analyst who stayed late to build this transaction model honestly. Every junior associate who flagged concerns and was told by your side not to overcomplicate things. Every partner who trusted me to decide whether character still belongs in a deal once the numbers get large enough." Blake let out a short breath through his nose, but it did not carry the old confidence anymore. "Character does not close deals," he said. Ava turned to him. "Neither does Rod," she replied. He looked away first. Margaret's fingers tightened in her lap. Lillian lowered her eyes to the stemware again, perhaps because crystal was easier to look at than consequence. Edward remained very still. "You are not wrong," he said quietly. "But if you walk away now, you do not only damage us. You damage the target company, the employees depending on this transaction, and the communities tied to its future. You know that." Ava heard the move for what it was the moment he made it. Not denial, not charm, moral redirection. She almost admired the craftsmanship of it. Almost. "Do not bring workers into this now like a shield," she said. "Not after your family treated people as invisible all evening unless they were useful." Her gaze flicked once toward the server by the wall, then back to Edward. He saw it. So did Margaret. A faint flush rose in Margaret's cheeks, the first real sign that the room had finally started reflecting itself accurately. Ava remembered the moment near the sideboard when that same young server dropped a single flute after Blake snapped at him for moving too slowly. The boy had gone pale. His hands had shaken. Blake had not asked if he was all right. He had only asked whether anyone on staff had been trained properly in this house. Ava had bent down then, gathered a few bright pieces of glass into a napkin, and told the boy softly to watch his hands. When she stood back up, Margaret had been watching her with that same puzzled expression people often wore when kindness arrived from someone they had already placed above or below the wrong line. Edward looked down at the memo again, then at the glowing phone, then finally back at Ava. "What would it take," he asked, "for you to believe tonight does not define all of us?" Ava held his gaze. Outside, the fountain kept lifting water into the dark, silver for a second before gravity brought it down again. She thought of every room that had underestimated her before hearing her numbers. Every airport lounge. Every board retreat. Every dinner where someone had spoken carefully enough to keep their conscience clean while still letting their assumption do its work. Tonight was not unique. That was why it mattered. "It may already define enough," she said. "But if you want a real answer, then here it is. Stop trying to persuade me that your intentions matter more than your actions. Stop asking me to grade your family on effort after I have lived through the result." Edward's shoulders lowered by half an inch. A small thing, but Ava saw it. It was the posture of a man beginning, finally, to understand that explanation and repair were not the same currency. Margaret stared at the table. Blake had gone silent for so long now that his silence itself felt like evidence. Lillian looked toward Ava once, quickly, with something fragile in her expression that might have been discomfort or shame, or simply the first time in her life she had ever wondered how many doors opened because no one thought to question her at them. Ava picked up her phone again. Her thumb moved once across the screen, opening the final draft. Withdrawal notice. Immediate effect. Legal review complete. Board authorization confirmed. The words glowed in clean white lines against the dark display. Edward saw the motion. He inhaled, then stopped himself from speaking too fast. Good. At least he was learning one thing tonight. Ava, he said, and now there was no performance left in her name. Only wait. If there is any room left for dignity here, I am asking you not to decide while anger is in the room. Ava looked at him, then at the untouched champagne, then at the silver dome still covering a dinner no one had earned the right to finish in peace. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to make everyone listen harder. That is the mistake you still make, she said. You think this is anger. It is judgment, and mine has already been signed. For the first time that night, no one looked at Ava like she was a guest. They looked at her like she was the one thing in the room they could not afford to lose, and Ava knew better than to confuse that with respect. Respect had a different temperature. It arrived earlier. It did not wait for leverage. It did not need candlelight, lawyers, and a collapsing deadline to find its voice. The room around her had gone so still that the soft mechanical hum of the climate control seemed loud now, running through the walls of the estate with the same indifferent precision as the fountain outside. The candles had burned lower. The champagne remained untouched. The silver dome over dinner reflected distorted faces and ceiling light, a warped little planet of wealth and appetite sitting in the center of a table where no one was hungry anymore. Ava lifted her phone and looked down at the draft one last time. The message had already been reviewed by counsel and approved by her board. Monroe Atlantic Partners hereby withdraws from the proposed transaction effective immediately. Clean words. Firm words. No drama in them at all. That was the beauty of legal language when it was used correctly. It did not raise its voice. It simply closed the door. Ava. Edward said her name again. But now it sounded less like an appeal and more like a man trying to keep pace with a consequence already moving past him. If you send that tonight, there will be no way to contain what follows. Ava looked up from the screen. Containment was your strategy, she said. Not mine. Blake pushed back from the table again, then stopped himself halfway to standing, as if even he could feel the childishness of motion without power behind it. His face had lost its easy color. Margaret sat rigid, one hand resting against the linen, her wedding ring catching the light in small, nervous flashes. Lillian had not spoken in several minutes. The quiet had settled over her like a lesson she had never expected to receive. Ava remembered seeing women like her at charity luncheons and museum boards. Women who could wound with a smile and call it culture, women who had spent their whole lives being reassured that refinement and goodness were cousins. Tonight the room had stripped that lie down to the studs. Edward leaned forward slightly. Then let me say this before you decide, he said. Ava said nothing. She let him continue because silence, in the right hands, can become a kind of mercy. Edward looked at the table rather than at her. I built this family's name believing polish could stand in for discipline, he said quietly. I allowed success to make us careless. And carelessness, in people with our reach, becomes its own kind of arrogance. I see that now. Margaret closed her eyes for one brief second. Blake stared at his father as though he were hearing a language that had never been spoken at home. Lillian's lips parted, then pressed together. The younger attorney near the end of the table stopped pretending to review his notes. Ava listened without interruption. The words were better than what had come before. More honest. Less decorated. But honesty after damage was still not repair. It was simply a cleaner mirror. You see it now, Ava said. Because it has a price. Edward did not argue. That, more than anything, told her he had finally reached the edge of performance. Outside, the fountain kept breathing silver into the night. Somewhere in the hall, the old clock marked another quarter hour. Time, Ava thought, was the one wealthy families always assumed would wait for them. She glanced toward the sideboard where the young server still stood, shoulders square, hands clasped, trying to look composed in a room that had asked him to disappear all evening. Ava met his eyes for a second. He looked down, but not before she saw the recognition there. Not triumph, not curiosity, just the quiet understanding of someone who had watched a room reveal itself and knew exactly what that felt like. Ava turned back to Edward. Do you know what changed this for me? She asked. He looked up. Not the memo, not even the lenders. Her gaze moved briefly toward Blake, then Margaret, then Lillian. It was the ease of it, the way judgment flowed through this house like background music. The way no one heard it because it sounded normal to you. Margaret's face tightened, but she said nothing. Blake lowered his eyes. Lillian looked suddenly very young. Ava unlocked her phone. The screen glowed in her hand, pale and final. Edward's breath slowed. He did not speak again. He knew now that whatever dignity remained in the room would not be saved by one more sentence. Ava placed her thumb over the send icon and held it there for half a heartbeat. Then she looked at Edward Holloway one last time. You asked what change would look like, she said. It looks like learning that money can delay consequences, but it cannot educate character. And with that, Ava pressed send. The sound it made was almost nothing. Just a soft digital chime from Ava's phone as the message left her hand and entered the world beyond the Holloway estate. But the effect of it moved through the room like winter finding a draft. No one spoke. No one reached for a glass. No one pretended anymore that this could still be folded back into a private misunderstanding between polished people at a long table. Ava lowered the phone and let the silence sit where it belonged. The candles burned low and steady. The silver dome over dinner reflected the room in bent, expensive fragments. Outside, the fountain kept sending water into the dark, unaware that inside the house a $900 million illusion had just been released into legal record. Edward Holloway did not close his eyes or bow his head or do anything theatrical. He simply sat there, looking at Ava with the exhausted clarity of a man who had spent too many years believing that timing could save him from character. Margaret's hand moved first. She reached for the edge of the tablecloth, fingers pressing lightly into the linen as if she needed to feel something real beneath them. Blake stared at Ava's phone like he could still somehow will the message back into draft form. Lillian's expression had lost every last trace of social ease. She looked like someone hearing a room describe her honestly for the first time. Across the table, the older attorney picked up his own phone, glanced at the screen, and then set it back down without saying a word. He did not need to. They all knew what came next. Counsel notified. Boards updated. Lenders alerted. The target company advised. The kind of chain reaction that did not care how old your family name was or how many portraits. Watch from the walls. Ava slipped her phone into the inside pocket of her blazer. The motion was calm, almost quiet enough to miss, but it seemed to mark the end of something larger than the transaction. Edward saw it too. Then it is done, he said. His voice was low, stripped bare of every polished layer he had worn at the start of the evening. Ava looked at him. Yes, she said. Blake stood so suddenly that his chair scraped hard against the hardwood, a sharp sound in the candlelit hush. You just destroyed months of work over one dinner, he said. The sentence came out too fast, carrying more panic than anger now. Ava turned toward him slowly. No, she said. Your family did that long before I walked in. I just refused to help you hide it. Blake opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. For once, he had reached the edge of the kind of confidence that feeds on rooms obeying him. There was nowhere for it to go now. Margaret looked at her son, then at Ava, then finally toward Edward, but whatever instinct she had left for social repair seemed to falter halfway to speech. Lillian lowered her face and stared at the untouched champagne flute in front of her. The bubbles were gone. All that remained was pale gold under chandelier light. Ava noticed the young server again near the sideboard. He had not moved from his place, but something in his posture had changed. He no longer looked like someone bracing for blame. He looked like someone witnessing a fact. That mattered to Ava more than any apology in the room. She reached into her folder and removed one final sheet, a clean withdrawal copy bearing Monroe Atlantic's formal letterhead. She slid it across the table toward Edward. He looked at it, then up at her. There is one more thing, Ava said. No one interrupted. My team will be contacting the target company directly in the morning. We are exploring a new structure through a separate consortium. If the underlying business is sound, it does not deserve to drown with your family's judgment. That changed the room again. Margaret looked up sharply. Blake's face drained. Lillian blinked as if the words had taken a second longer to reach her. Edward closed his eyes then, only for a moment, but long. Enough for the truth to land in full. Not only had Ava walked away, she had found a path that did not require them. That was the blow their kind always felt deepest, not rejection, but irrelevance. Ava gathered the rest of her papers with smooth, exact movements. No drama. No shaking hands. No victory in it. Only completion. You are cutting us out, Blake said, almost under his breath. Ava met his eyes. "No," she said. "I am choosing not to build with rot just because it wears a tuxedo." The line hung there, clean and cold. Edward looked older again, but this time it was not pressure alone. It was recognition. He rose slowly from his chair, not to stop her, not to argue, just to stand as she prepared to leave. After a beat, Margaret stood too. Then Lillian. Blake hesitated, then followed. It was not respect in the purest sense. It was something more brittle and more honest. The acknowledgement that power had changed sides and that everyone in the room knew it. Ava closed the folder under her arm and gave a single nod. Not warm, not cruel, simply final. "Good night," she said. And no one at the table had the language left to answer her with anything but silence. Ava turned and walked toward the long gallery without hurry, her heels striking the hardwood in a measured rhythm that seemed louder now that no one else in the room knew what to say. Behind her, the Holloways remained standing around the dinner table, caught in the last thin glow of candles and chandelier light, their reflections broken across silver and glass. She did not look back. She had spent too many years looking back at rooms that had already told her exactly what they thought she was. The gallery opened ahead in a line of shadow and warm light, framed photographs and oil portraits watching from the walls with the calm entitlement of people who had always expected history to flatter them. Ava passed them one by one, black suit clean against the pale walls, folder tucked beneath her arm, shoulders steady. The estate had felt different when she arrived. Back then, it had seemed designed to impress. Now it felt designed to conceal. The same marble floors, the same polished wood, the same museum silence. But once truth entered a place, luxury stopped looking noble and started looking expensive. A few steps ahead, the young server from the sideboard stood near the hallway entrance, holding a silver tray against his chest. He moved aside the moment he saw her coming, almost instinctively, as if the habits of service had been trained deeper than comfort. Ava slowed. For a second, neither of them spoke. Up close, he looked even younger than she had thought, maybe 19, maybe 20, his collar too tight, his expression careful in the way people learn to be when they spend enough time around money that is not theirs. "You handled yourself well tonight," Ava said softly. The words were simple, but the young man blinked as if no one in that house had ever spoken to him that way. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. His voice was quiet, respectful, but not flat. Human. Ava gave a small nod. Then, from the inside pocket of her blazer, she slipped out a card and held it toward him. He looked down at it, then back at her, uncertain. "If you ever want a better room," she said, "send a resume there." He stared at the card for half a heartbeat before taking it with careful fingers. "I will," he said, and this time something warmer moved through his voice, something like surprise trying to become hope. Ava nodded once more and kept walking. Behind her, the hallway remained quiet. She did not need to see the Holloways to know they had heard at least part of it. That mattered more than any final speech. At the front of the house, the double doors opened before she reached for the handle. One of the older staff members stood there, silver-haired, composed, wearing the kind of formal black uniform that made people like the Holloways feel like houses ran on elegance instead of labor. He stepped aside respectfully. "Your car is waiting, Ms. Monroe," he said. Ava paused just long enough to meet his eyes. There was no performance in them, only recognition. "Thank you," she said. Outside, the night air met her skin cool and clean, carrying the scent of clipped hedges, damp stone, and the faint metallic trace of an autumn evening settling over Connecticut. The fountain in the circular drive kept lifting water into the dark, silver for a breath before it fell again. Her driver had already pulled. The sedan up beneath the front lanterns, the headlights throwing long pale lines across the gravel. Ava stepped down the front stairs slowly, the house rising behind her in white columns and amber windows, all of it still beautiful in the way a lie can remain beautiful after it has been exposed. Just before she reached the car, her phone vibrated once inside her blazer. Then again. Then a third time. Board confirmations. Council acknowledgments. One message from her chief operating officer. Consortium call locked for 6:30 a.m. Another from her lead analyst. Target company receptive. Moving fast. Ava let herself exhale then. Not with relief exactly, but with release. The kind that comes when a decision stops belonging to debate and finally becomes fact. She slid into the back seat, set the folder beside her, and looked out through the window as the driver closed the door with a muted thud. From that angle, the Holloway estate looked almost unreal, glowing against the dark like a postcard mailed from a country that no longer existed. Up in the dining room, through the tall glass, she could still see movement. A figure crossing behind the candles. Another standing still. No music. No celebration. Just the afterimage of power learning, too late, that it could be refused. The car rolled forward in silence, tires whispering over gravel, then turned through the gates and out onto the road. Ava rested one hand lightly over the folder in her lap and watched the estate lights shrink in the rear window until they dissolved into the dark. Her reflection surfaced faintly in the glass, calm and unreadable, framed by passing trees and the thin silver wash of moonlight. She thought of the untouched champagne, the bent reflections in the silver dome, the way the room had stood when she left, not because they had become good, but because they had finally understood that her power did not need their approval to exist. Ava looked out at the road ahead, black ribbon under the headlights, and allowed herself one final thought before the night carried her forward. They had seen her skin before they saw her power, and that mistake had cost them everything they thought money could protect.